Welcome to a much belated Biota.org chat. I'm Tom Barbalet, and today we pick up in a conversation held with Gerald de Jong and myself about 2 weeks ago with regards to his new development in Darwin at Home and whether it is taking a distinctly Lamarckian approach. So, what was lost in the last edit of the last chat was the discussion with regards to how you construct the super stem cells to not be part of a Lamarckian simulation as opposed to a Darwinian simulation, and then really me thinking out loud about whether in a Darwinian simulation for what you were doing you could approach it from almost a Lamarckian angle. Now, you've had a couple of weeks to think about that. What's your analysis with regards to that?
Yeah, in one way, I've read a lot of Dawkins, and I think a lot in terms of selection and as the whole engine, and anything Lamarckian doesn't seem right, but that's partly because he was talking about biology, and he was talking scientifically. He was saying, look, in what we observe, it doesn't appear to be the case that things work in a Lamarckian fashion.
What you're trying to do with these kind of super stem cells sounds initially to be Lamarckian. There needs to be some underlying structure.
I would like to convince you that there's nothing Lamarckian about it at the moment. Not that I wouldn't consider it. I mean, what I was trying to say was, Darwin may have, Darwin may have observed that, Lamarckian evolution doesn't happen in the biological world, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be done in an artificial world.
In terms of the stem cell analogy, what led into it was unfortunately edited out of the last chat, was my own musing that you would need to have some additional component that related to some kind of, it's genotype versus phenotype fundamentally, that you need something that is modelling some genetics that it can change subtly but will ultimately define whether a foot is grown or an eye is grown or something like that. You need the underlying structure as well. And I wasn't sure whether there was a kind of Lamarckian chaos element to it.
I think the way you have to look at it is the changes have to be sort of orthogonal or completely uncorrelated to what eventually happens. Up till now in Darwin at Home, I've been very careful to maintain that. They have, the mutations are completely, there's nothing planned, there's nothing that changes during a lifetime.
So what you're saying is that most of them would grow feet, and then one of them would mutate and grow an eyeball instead. And if that was of evolutionary advantage, then it would have children that would propagate that would then have eyeballs instead of feet.
Yeah, beyond that, though, imagine, you have to keep placing yourself inside of one of these intervals, because that's the actual cell. So suppose you had a mutation and you were situated somewhere down one of the legs, and you're more or less vertical, and you decide, by mutation, you have no idea why, but somehow you have this certain compulsion to every few cycles to take a peek, in your direction, which is from one joining point to the next, which in your case points straight upwards. So, you'll observe every once in a while, but you won't see a damn thing. So, eventually that mutation will have proved to have no real purpose. And if there's any advantage to not doing it, in other words, spending a bit more time being a muscle, for example, then it will probably once again disappear.
Here's an interesting idea, because I think certainly in books like The Ancestor's Tale, but also my observations of other biological treatises with regards to how very bizarre things happen in nature, the eyeball example is a good one, because what would happen, or what may happen, is that the limb then falls down and mysteriously sees the world, and then the creature starts slithering rather than standing upright, and these kind of things. Do you have a sense that, and this is of course all predictive in terms of discussing what may happen in the simulation, but do you have a sense that certain organs like eyes and perhaps fat stores and perhaps neurons and these kind of things will have heavier weighting than bones or muscles or these kind of things that are have a different quality to them, or do you think that everything will have equal weighting in terms of its productive use?
I really have trouble predicting something like that. One thing I'm working on right now, which working on in terms of like thinking about from time to time, because I haven't had a lot of time to code, but trying to work out some sort of communication sort of structure or network within the body, and it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to resemble a biological creature so directly, but there has to be some way to if should you decide you happen to be up on top and facing in an appropriate direction and horizontal, and you decide at some point that by accident or mutation that you decide to be an eye, and suddenly you see things and you start reporting that. How do you report that to the muscles? And that's and what can you report? How can you affect their behavior? Interestingly enough, I was listening to one of the many science podcasts that I love to listen to when I go for walks, and there was a guy talking about the salamander, and they made a sort of a salamander robot. And interestingly, the way he described it was in the biology of the salamander, there's a sort of a cycle built in to take steps, and it's not sort of sensory based. It's got some sort of a rhythm to it, but he could prove scientifically that it wasn't based on, individual sensory reactions and some sort of cycle in that sense, involving the senses. There was a sort of a cycle inside. And the modification that could happen then is it could be sort of reduced or enhanced. So there's this sort of automatic, almost timing cycle, really, in the legs.
If we return to the discussion that we had on possible worlds with regards to ants. This was exactly my thinking in the ant example, and something that I've reflected on over the past couple of weeks, is that my own view with regards to possible worlds, particularly possible worlds that are in any way simulated or shown to a user for choices to be made that affect evolution and things of that nature, is that the possible worlds that are shown need to be in some sense meaningful. And I think that was the distinction that you and I were having in that discussion. Certainly when I reflect on ants and even human movement, even bipod or quadrupod movement, is that there are obviously things that could happen. I mean, you could spontaneously start kicking, or the ants could do can-cans or things like that. I mean, there are a wide variety of possibilities, but within that there are probable limitations. And I think what fascinates me about what you were saying about the salamanders, my own thinking on ants, and I think, is it Rodney Brooke at MIT who did all the robotic ant stuff? I mean, the ability for these things to be maybe not hardwired, but at least to work synchronously needs to be part of it as well. And maybe that cuts down the number of possible worlds.
I remember seeing, I forget now the name, but there was some guy who built tiny insect-like things. They did what they did because of like 3 or 4 transistors. It was a very, very, very minimal sort of cycle system built in. And they were actual physical things. You would sort of solder some stuff together.
I think the earliest of that comes through the 50s, and my memory of the fellow's name isn't particularly good. But when I saw Bruce Damer most recently, he was with a fellow who works at NASA on robotics, who had never explored the most primitive end of robotics. And I thought, as you've discussed, that what's fascinating about robotics is that you can get a lot of intelligence out of a very small chipset, basically. And moreover, it's actually quite productive to have a smaller chipset, particularly if you're sending these things off to Mars and things like that. You want to have certain redundancies built into the system.
Well, I was listening to Noble Ape just on my bike the other day, and you were talking about something that you've mentioned before. You're like reintroducing the predators. And to me, that's just an absolutely fascinating thing to be able to say. It's something that I could never say about what I'm doing, because if I ever see something like predation, I'll be blown away.
It's a bit like a baby learning to kind of move in initial phases. If there was a large predatorial creature that preyed on the baby moving, but basically there wouldn't be very many babies left. And the problem with Noble Ape was, in its infancy, I thought, great, I'll put in these fierce predatorial cats that will prey on the apes. And you run the simulation with these entities in the simulation, particularly in the early phases of the simulation when I was still ironing things out, and there weren't a lot of apes after a very short amount of time. time. So I thought, okay, I need to make this more utopian, remove the large predatorial cats and just tune the apes wandering, so to speak.
But the simple fact that you can say large predatorial cats. I mean, this is try to imagine. I'm still trying to evolve something like an insect body.
True. You need to appreciate as well, when I first started developing Noble Ape, bone structure and musculature were central tenets in the initial simulation. I constructed both the predatorial cats and the apes in terms of the skeletal system that had various precession properties with regards to movement.
And that was part of the simulation?
It was an immense, naive, and truly wonderful period that created a lot of drawings, a lot of code, and not really... It's a bit like, I guess, maybe over-engineering some kind of vehicle that then cannot actually move because it's weighed down by its own engineering, so to speak. But no, it was a very idealistic period.
You're sort of, interestingly, this is sort of like you were trying to make initially a sort of a physical place where you've actually got musculature and movements and that, and then eventually see some sort of cooperative or predatory behavior or whatever. But I'm starting from the point of trying to build a body from so it's fascinating that you would. What I'm trying to figure out then is, if it's not that, what is it? Because this is all that I do.
I mean, what fascinates me about artificial life developers is that we all start from different places. We all have some kind of introduction to artificial life, typically through reading various seminal books. But from that, we take from what interests us and construct simulations which are very, very different, and have very, very different initial premises, and have very, very different assumptions about what life is and assumptions about what they're looking to explore and these kind of things. But what fascinates me is the diversity of artificial life simulations from what is probably just half a dozen books at the well, I mean, we probably both started developing around the same time, and in my own reflection, the books that caused me to start developing artificial life, some of them weren't even artificial life texts. I mean, that's what fascinates me, but just the idea of the potential. Can you talk a little bit about your own kind of formative ideas in the books and the things that led you to start the simulation as you have?
Yeah, I was just thinking this just now. You could actually make serious argument that what you and I have done doesn't even overlap slightly. In certain ways, it doesn't overlap at all.
I think the term artificial life is problematic in that regard. But at the same time, I also think that there are shared... obviously this chat, amongst other things, but there are shared discussions that can be had. And it's not that we're doing something that is fundamentally different. It's just we're approaching things from considerably different, initial conditions, considerably different premises. And, ideally, I think we move towards similar conclusions.
Well, let me describe a little bit where it all comes from, because it's interesting. I didn't... my impression of what you did is you sort of came into it from philosophy or something like that, and then started playing around and got fascinated by it. But I came in from a completely different angle. I was fascinated by geometry. It was like years and years and years until I decided to play around and see if these things could actually move. So we used to have a sort of a club on internet on a mailing list, and we would sit there and we would build structures, and I built the software to have these structures built, and they were all elastic intervals. It was the same sort of thing that's happening now, but we would build them and we would experiment with them and we would sort of talk about them and see what they could do. Eventually I ended up building structures that I translated into things you could see in active worlds, and there was a whole huge dome full of creature-like structures that were built with my software, but none of it moved and none of it had any sort of anything resembling artificial life, really. It was sort of fun to build structures that looked like an insect or something, but that was the end of it. We were building all sorts of different kinds of structures. We were experimenting with sort of like Buckminster Fuller ideas of how does a tensegrity actually work? What does it feel like to play around with a tensegrity? And I don't know if you know, tensegrity is a very strange form of structure. What you have is the pushing elements don't touch each other, and they're sort of suspended in a network of tension. And that's the fascinating thing about it. You can actually build structures using tensegrity, and they have a certain robustness about them because the pushing elements are usually solid, and the pulling elements are like cables. So if the bars don't touch each other, then you have a whole different dynamic. The whole structure, the structure as a whole, functions as a unit. So these were all very fun things to play with. And so I came from the geometry, from playing with the geometry, and the iterative sort of pseudo-physical geometry. And then sometime, quite a bit later, I started playing around with seeing if I could make them, learn to do things.
In clarification on your initial comments, my background interest wasn't necessarily philosophy with regards to the development of Noble Ape. I was actually more interested in software and the propagation of ideas through software, which may be philosophy in some regard. But I thought that really the only productive motivation of any previously written on paper discipline in some regard was through software, and this was a kind of fascinating point in my own thinking. Now, returning to the Buckminster Fuller ideas, when you use the terminology of tensors and things like that, I always return to my kind of physical chemistry reading and background study. And it always fascinates me that when you start talking about tensors and tensegrity and these kind of things, I always see crystalline structures and these kind of things, but you are fundamentally talking about it as almost architectural things, aren't you?
First of all, let me be a little clear here. One point to clarify: tensors and tensegrity have nothing to do with each other, as far as I know, at least. So those are two completely different things. Tensegrity is just a name for a certain kind of structure.
But aren't tensors the mathematical representation of the things that hold the structures together?
If they are, then it's strange that I wouldn't know about it.
Okay.
It's all vectors.
But my understanding was that tensors were particular kinds of force vectors that were bound at points.
They could be, but that's... I looked into it a little bit. I never really understood what they were, but they were... it's much more complicated than what I'm doing, put it that way. It's just pure vectors.
But they're vectors that hold forces in what you're saying as well. I mean, the joining cables and even the solid structures are actually containing forces in order to hold everything together. So that's the mathematical representation, surely.
You can't really speak of solid things in my geometry thing here. What you have to actually think about is the 4 dimensions, because it's not meaningful really until the geometries are experiencing time. So, they become elastic, of course, when they exist in time. So these elastic intervals, they're just every tick of the clock, they decide what to do in the next tick of the clock. And without the clock operating, the whole thing is completely static. And then you get the crystalline ideas that you've got when you think of this kind of geometry. And when most people think of this kind of geometry, whenever you see triangles and tetrahedrons and things, you think, okay, that's crystal.
If you're interested in contributing to the Biota.org conversations, interviews, chat, feed, either in audio or commentary or questions or things of that nature, please get in contact with me, tom@nobleape.com. Thank you very much for listening to this podcast. Look forward to you tuning into the next podcast.